Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking zero trust, which, let's be honest, gets thrown around like a massive corporate buzzword, and we're turning it into a concrete, actionable blueprint. If you're gearing up for your CompTIA Security Plus exam, specifically Objective 1.2, or you just really want to wrap your head around the modern gold standard of network defense, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to break down this whole complex architecture and make it visually intuitive and, more importantly, super easy to remember.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the core philosophy, then break down the control and data planes, look at verifying adaptive identity, design some security zones, introduce the policy decision makers, and finally, we'll put it all together into one seamless workflow.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the core philosophy, looking at legacy versus zero trust. To really get where we're going, we first have to burn down that old castle and moat security assumption.
You know the old way, right? Legacy networks are basically like a piece of candy with a hard outer shell and a totally soft center. Once you actually make it through the firewall, the inside of the network is pretty much wide open. Users, and way more dangerously, malicious software, can just move from system to system with almost zero checks and balances. But zero trust completely flips that script. Just like the name implies, literally nothing is trusted by default. You have to authenticate and prove who you are every single time you want to access a resource. And hey, this isn't just for human users. We're talking about every device, every background process, every single thing traversing the network. And that brings us to this idea of threat scope reduction. Because look, if malware does somehow slip in, we absolutely have to make sure it can't just run wild. By strictly limiting the privileges of users and systems, we shrink the potential points of attack. In the biz, we call this minimizing the blast radius. Think of it like a submarine. If one workstation gets compromised, zero trust acts like those heavy steel bulkheads. It completely seals off that specific threat so it doesn't sink the entire organization.
Moving right along to Section 2, Control and Data Planes, where we get into functional separation. Because to actually build a zero-trust environment, we have to break our security devices down into smaller individual functional pieces.
Think of the control plane as the brain of your entire network. It's the management part of the architecture, making all the really intelligent decisions based on predefined rules. Whether we're dealing with a physical switch in a server room, a virtual firewall, or a cloud security process, the control plane is where the management magic actually happens. Anytime you're setting up a routing table or tweaking a firewall rule, you're operating strictly in the control plane. It literally tells the network exactly how it needs to behave.
Now, if the control plane is the brain, the data plane is absolutely the brawn, doing all the heavy lifting. You'll sometimes hear this called the forwarding plane, and it's where the actual real-time transmission of user data happens. So while the control plane sits back in the manager's office making the rules, the data plane is out there on the floor, actively processing frames and packets, enforcing those policies and making sure data is routed or blocked exactly how the brain dictated.
Which takes us to Section 3, verifying adaptive identity. Now that our devices are split up functionally, we need a way to constantly evaluate trust. Remember, zero trust means we're never just checking a password once and waving you through the gate.
We've all been there, right? Your company suddenly hits you with a multi-factor authentication prompt just because you logged in from a coffee shop in a new city. Well, that is adaptive identity in action. It's dynamically adjusting your security based on specific contextual factors. We aren't just looking at the password you typed, we're looking at the whole picture. Let's say a user wants data based in the US, but suddenly their source IP is popping up in Europe. The system instantly flags that. It also checks your relationship, like are you a full-time employee or a contractor? Are you on a secure VPN or public Wi-Fi? By evaluating all these variables automatically, the system ramps up the security precisely when and where it's needed most.
All right, Section 4, Designing Security Zones. Once we actually know who the user is, we need to look at where they're coming from and where they're going to contain potential threats.
So traditionally, you'd have these implicit trust zones. Basically, if you were sitting at a desk inside the corporate HQ, the network blindly assumed you were safe to access the internal data center. Zero Trust steps in and says, yeah, absolutely not. We take that blind faith and replace it with strict security zones. We heavily scrutinize the path of every single conversation. If some traffic from an untrusted zone tries to reach a trusted zone, boom, we automatically deny or heavily inspect it. We're confining breaches by making sure trust is never assumed, no matter where you happen to be sitting.
Let's jump to Section 5, the policy decision makers. We've got the philosophy and the zones down, but how on earth do we manage the actual data flow? Seriously, how do we actually enforce all these policies? Well, it comes down to the tangible hardware, software, and personnel that actually do the policing on the network. To make this zero-trust dream a reality, we rely on 4 key players working together. Let's meet them.
First up is the subject, or system. Remember our core rule. Subjects are always treated as potential threats, and we have to verify their permissions before we give them an inch of access. Now, a subject isn't always a human typing at a keyboard. It could just as easily be a background process running on a server or an app trying to download an update. Inside the building, outside the building, it doesn't matter. They're all treated with total suspicion until they prove they belong.
Next, we have the Policy Enforcement Point, or PEP. You can really just think of this as the ultimate bouncer at the club. Any traffic trying to cross your network absolutely has to get past this point. And while it might look like a single box on a diagram, in the real world, the PEP could be a whole cluster of firewalls, routers, and switches. The PEP stops the subject at the door and collects their ID and context. But here's the catch. It doesn't actually make the final call on whether they get in. It passes that info up the chain.
And that brings us to the policy engine. This is the ultimate rulebook. Remember that control plane we talked about earlier? The policy engine lives right there. It takes that request from our bouncer, cross-references it against every single predefined security policy your organization has, and makes a definitive, real-time decision: grant, deny, or revoke.
Finally, we have the Policy Administrator. If the engine is the one making the decision, the administrator is the one actually executing it. As the manager of this whole process, it takes that grant or deny verdict from the policy engine, generates the actual access tokens, and shoots those credentials right back down to the policy enforcement point. That way, the bouncer knows exactly what to do with the subject waiting at the door.
All right, here we are at the climax, Section 6, putting it all together. We've got all our pieces on the board, so let's watch this workflow in action. Let's track a single request, moving from an untrusted zone all the way to a trusted enterprise resource. Step 1. Our subject, maybe a guy on a public Wi-Fi network, tries to access a corporate database over the data plane. He immediately hits our bouncer, the policy enforcement point. Step 2. The PEP pauses everything and passes the subject's contextual data up to the policy administrator. Step 3. The administrator hands it over to the policy engine, the brain, which evaluates the IP, the location, the device health against the rules, and says, okay, yep, this looks safe. Step 4. That verdict goes back to the policy administrator, which mints the access token and hands it right back down to the PEP. And finally, Step 5, the policy enforcement point gets the green light and grants that subject access to the specific enterprise resource they wanted. It's just a totally elegant, continuous loop of verification.
So as you gear up for your Security Plus exam, or honestly, even if you're just looking at your own company's infrastructure, I want you to ask yourself, where in your network are you still relying on implicit trust? Have you actually eliminated those blind spots, or are devices still roaming freely just because they're plugged into an office wall? Zero trust isn't something you can just buy off a shelf in a box. It's a complete mindset shift in how you view every single packet of data. Look closely at the architecture we just mapped out, find those legacy weak points, and start verifying everything. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep that curiosity sharp.